Is the global economy entering an area of military Keynesianism? Welcome back to the Think BRICS channel. Today we are honored to welcome Professor Vidhu Shekhar, who is an economist and associate professor at the S.P. Jain Institute of Management and Research in Mumbai, India. In his recent analysis for Swarzia and Deccan Herald, Professor Shekhar argued that as the traditional stimulus tools exhaust themselves in a debt-saturated world, governments are increasingly turning to defense spending as the last viable lever to sustain growth. But what happens when economic stability becomes structurally dependent on rearmament? And how does that shift impact the Global South's quest for strategic autonomy? Professor Shekhar, thank you so much for joining us again today.
Thanks, Benjamin. Pleasure to be here.
Yeah, and let's dive right into this. So, can you first explain to our audience sort of what Keynesianism is, sort of as an economic discipline, and how military Keynesianism sort of differentiates from that?
Yes, sure. So Keynesianism, right? So this, of course, takes the name from the famous economics John Maynard Keynes. And this is the argument that when the private sector, so we all know that, or at least we witness that financial cycle is one truth of the global economies, right? So wherever you see, there will be a financial cycle, either a boom cycle or a bust cycle that keeps on occurring every couple of years. Definitely a couple every decade is what you will see. So Keynes argued what happens in this kind of cycles is that when there is a down cycle, and that typically happens if there is no private investment that is taking place for various reasons, and we'll perhaps discuss the reasons also subsequently, then what to do at that point of time? So his argument was that the government can step in with public investment to substitute for the private investment and thereby jumpstart the economy when the economy is not doing well. So that's traditional Keynesianism, but there is a variety. So what kind of investment can government do? I mean, there is a famous thinking which says that government can, just dig a hole and then fill it. That will still jumpstart the economy because that's an investment going into the economy. It will produce employment and this and that. But that's an extreme example. Nobody will do that. But typically, you'll see government coming up, putting up infrastructure, are doing some big investment in the frontier areas, let's say semiconductors or AI and stuff like that. So that's a traditional way of government coming in, right? But then there is another method of government coming in, and which on and off gets utilized very heavily, where the government starts spending heavily on military expenditure, right? So they start expending heavily. The public investment is now geared towards what we will call as military Keynesianism, So rather than regular sectors, it's the military sectors that takes the precedence, right? And that becomes military Keynesianism, where the government to counter the economic slowdown starts spending on military as a way to jumpstart, a way to maintain the economy. So that's what it is.
And so, when you're mentioning before that this using defense spending is sort of this sort of last lever to sustain growth, what is making, I guess, so like, what are the, why is the money that the government is putting towards civilian sectors not nearly as reliable to sustain growth recently as in for defense spending, for example?
All right. Yeah, that's the interesting part. And for that, we must have a somewhat decent understanding of financial cycles themselves. So how do financial cycles, or what makes financial cycles work, right? So if you go by the mainstream economics, the economics that we all study, or that economics that predominates our academia, they will tell you that there should not be any cycles. It's an equilibrium state, and technological shocks come, and therefore some ups and downs would happen, but it's a stable scenario. So what I like to give as an example is a difference between a passenger aircraft versus a military aircraft. So a passenger aircraft is in a stable equilibrium, right? So it's moving. It's stable equilibrium in the sense that if you push the joystick in one direction, let's say go up, and then if you leave the joystick, it'll come back to the same equilibrium. So it'll keep on moving. It's automatically, it stabilizes, right? So that is the view of the mainstream economics. As against that, if you look at a military aircraft, it is also in an equilibrium and it's flying. But the difference against a civilian aircraft is that if you take the joystick on one side and just leave it, so for example, if flight starts going like this, if you leave that, it'll keep on going like this, right? So it'll become increasingly become more unstable as if you leave it as it is, right? So that's dynamic kind of equilibrium, right? So the mainstream economics says it's a stable aircraft or civilian aircraft kind of equilibrium as a metaphor, while there are strands of economics, especially on the heterodox economic side, which says that no, the cycles are an inherent nature of a capitalistic financial economy, right? Cycles is one thing that will occurs on its own, endogenous. It happens because the system is like that, right? So it says more like it's a military aircraft, so it can't keep on stable. It will keep on moving in ups and downs, kind of a variety, and that's what financial cycles. So if we align with that heterodox theory, primarily post-Keynesian theories, they will argue that the cycles come because of the borrowings that are done by, or lendings that are done by households and the firms, the corporate firms, the corporate, right? So households borrow and then they consume. Firms borrow and then they produce, right? So that is the nature, and there is a tendency of going overboard. So you will see that they start borrowing, then keep on borrowing, and then there is a kind of a borrowing frenzy on the both side, and then it reaches a kind of a boom because everybody is borrowing and everybody is consuming and everybody is producing. And then after that boom, it kind of spills over. There is too much of borrowing, bad debts come up, and then you have to kind of control the economics, and then there is less borrowing, less number of people are now doing the same thing, and that turns into a burst. So a boom bust cycle happens because of borrowings on the private balance sheet side, not on the public side. So public is the government balance sheet. The private balance sheet essentially is household and firms. So they are the private balance sheet that is there, right? And each of this cycle kind of pushes the overall leverage of the system at a higher level, right? So we call this as private debt, right? Each cycle, so there will be a boom cycle where everybody is borrowing like crazy, then they reaches a level where it can't be sustained, then there is a bust cycle. So that bust would not take it to a zero leverage. It'll so let's say start with 10% leverage, it'll go to 50% leverage, then it'll come down to 20% leverage, then the other cycle starts and it'll take on to 70% leverage. So it travels like that, with the important classifier being that it is a private debt, not the public debt. So we are talking about regular households and regular firms whose debt determines the financial cycle, right? So when bust happens, because now private sector is not borrowing and spending, public is not borrowing and consuming, the government steps in and does public debt at that point of time and does investment and consumption both on its side, right? And because each of the cycle kind of takes the leverage up, after 4-5 cycles, the leverage reaches a stratospheric level, right? So it might start with a leverage of the society, might start with a clean balance sheet. It has got no debt, right? But it accumulates with each cycle and might reach a level where the private debt, which is the household and the firm debt, is at a level of 200% of GDP, right? So it becomes so high that beyond that, there is not possible to borrow more and consume more or produce more, right? The cycles get exhausted. The balance sheet is in a bad shape, both of the firms and the household. They don't have power to borrow more, right? So can you borrow more if you are at 30% leverage? Yes, you can borrow more. At 50% leverage, yes, you can borrow more. But if 70-80% of your income is going in paying back the old debt, you can't borrow new, even if the interest rate of debt is very low. So typically what happens in such kind of a scenario, that the central banks will take the rates to zero, right? But can you borrow more even if the rates is zero, if you're already paying 80% of your income as an EMI? You can't, even if the rate is zero. That is a situation which is traditionally known as Minsky Moment, after the great economist Hyman Minsky, at which point it becomes absolutely impossible for the economy to really grow any fast. It reaches a level where it can just barely grow. And this was the situation that happened with Japan in 1980s, late 80s. where, if prior to 1980s, if Japan was the star, and whatever we hear about China today, that was a story of Japan in prior to 1980s, right? It was producing audio. Sony was there. There was a whole host of auto industry was there. It was actually breathing down the neck of the US auto industry, so on and so forth. But then Minsky moment after now, you see there are couple of lost decades that have been there with Japan, because the household, the consumers, the people are borrowed heavily, the firms are borrowed heavily, both balance sheet are in bad shape, nothing new can happen, right? Same happened to US in 2008, right? And I'll tell you the difference. When the financial cycle is at an earlier stage, you are at a stage where the balance sheet is not that bad. That scene was in 2000, the dot-com crash. At that point of time, US also went to buy, the investment frenzy. Everything was investing in internet, but the balance sheet was not at a level which would not lead to next cycle to come, right? So therefore, you see, US recovered from 2000 fairly easily. Couple of years, low rates, and you saw another boom. But 2008 was a time when the balance sheet was again at a level of 150, 160, 170%, right? China went into that mode around 2016, 17, 18. So around in last 5-7 years, China has reached a stage where the balance sheet of the firms as well as the consumer both are exhausted, right? And now this is now a trap. What happens when both balance sheets are exhausted? Even if now government spends, because the balance sheet is exhausted, the civilian channels just don't work. Even if I give you money to put up a factory for a firm, let's say I push a lot of money in the real estate sector and I say that I'll create new houses, right? But who will buy them? Because the consumers are either paying EMI on the older houses that they bought and the older stock market investing that they did. They can't buy it only. So you end up creating what? You end up creating ghost towns, right? You try, and that has been happening with China. By the way, they have been trying to induce consumption for a long period of time. They have not been able to, right? So these balance sheet, the impairment of the balance sheet of the firms as well as household leads to a situation where even if government pushes something, it will have only a marginal effect on the overall economy. It cannot push the economy back into a running mode. It can maybe push it a bit, so it can maybe walk like a zombie, but that's all it is. It cannot run. It will just somehow walk. But there is one sector, and that is where the military sector comes in, where there is no issue of balance sheet at all. Why is there no issue? Because in military sector, it's the government which is the producer, it's the government which is the buyer, right? There is no household balance sheet involved. There is no firm balance sheet involved. You are the producer, you are the consumer. So you producing or investing in military then becomes the fastest way of inflating, or fastest way of making production rise in the economy, right? And that's what we are seeing. So almost all of the world, if you'll see, Japan in 1980s, US in 2000 years, Europe in 2008, China in late 2000s, have exhausted the civilian balance sheets completely. Then very few sectors remain where you can still invest and get away with something. Military is one. Another is space, of course. Space is again very government dependent. The problem of space is you cannot really push in a lot of money over there. Military, the scale is much larger. So then military becomes kind of a default assumption or default option to push the economy. And that's what we are witnessing today. Sorry if that was a long answer, but I thought it deserved
No, that was actually, I actually really appreciate the explanation, and just and like you made a really good point. Like if my balance sheet, if my budget is exhausted, if a government is going to try to invest some more into the civilian sector, it's not going to have nearly as much of effect, because like you've been pointing out, for government and business alike, if you don't have money to spend to the thing that the government is investing in for your sector, it's not going to have nearly as much an improvement. So I actually want to get something. I'm curious about this, about investing in the military sector, because when we talk about a lot of the investment now we talk about green energy, but namely artificial intelligence. You can see how artificial intelligence sort of grasps in the stain of like helping civilian sectors and business in terms of productivity and things like that, but also in terms of military and defense spending. I guess like for the sake of this argument here, for the United States, are they investing in artificial intelligence, all of these deals, everything you see pushed out in the news? Is this mainly for defense spending and defense capabilities nowadays because they know that United States citizens don't have enough, don't have much money to work with?
Yeah. So a very interesting thing that you point out. If you reflect on the history, you will see that the financial crisis and technological innovation go almost hand in hand. So we had a internet as a great innovation, and we had a dot-com boom and bust. We had 2008, and that 2008 gave us a lot of chips. It gave us blockchain, it gave us AI at the initial stages, it gave us APIs. So many tech also came at that point of time. Even now, when ChatGPT was coming up, the OpenAI was coming up, the Silicon Valley Bank was failing. So if you will see this parallel between why crises and bank failures happen at the same time when great technological innovation happen, the link is that any kind of a great technological innovation really takes a lot of money, not in one innovation, but you to fund great technological innovation, because by nature innovation is uncertain. You don't know which innovation is going to work, how it is going to work, and stuff like that. So you have to make fund available for thousands of the company for that 1, 2, 3 company to really make a breakthrough innovation, right? So any breakthrough great innovation requires a flood of money so that everybody gets funded and something comes out of it, right? Because nobody would know. If OpenAI was born in a scenario where the funding was tight, OpenAI would not have created anything. They exhausted billions of dollars to create what OpenAI is. They could get $1 billion for promising that I will make a talking engine. That looks like, now that we are seeing it, but that looks like a dream scenario. It can't really happen. Who will fund them, right? So you need scenarios where there can be free flow of money for great innovations to take place. And it is this same free flow of money which leads to a financial crisis. So that's why they go hand in hand. So why I brought it over here is because there is another source of free flow of money, and that is military, right? Where the money goes, the audit is going to be hardly there. We all know the great stories about how big a hole there is in Pentagon's balance sheet, where they just can't say where the money went, right? So the military has the power of really funding moonshot innovations, right? And so I suspect, yes, in that sense, that when you are trying to find avenues which can work, you tend to start funding those scenarios which are at the frontier, because older ones are either way exhausted. Nothing much can happen over there. So on what account would you give money over there? So if take the example of China, where can it spend, right? It has already put up solar panels capacity which is more than the global demand itself. What is the point of investing anything more over there? And that is a scenario with not just one, multiple sectors of China, all investment exhausted. Then do what? Oh, I'll do AI because the sky is open right now, right? So yes, that also becomes a frontier, becomes a channel of trying to push the economy at a stage where all the existing sectors have already been exhausted. Their balance sheet is in bad shape. You can't do much about them. So let's push in something new. So that is a part of the same thing. Yes.
Yeah. And so, like, let's sort of extrapolate more on this. Extrapolate more on this sort of economic philosophy, like we've been talking about. So, suppose that let's agree that for our economy to be not just to grow more, but to also be more stable, it needs to rely more on defense spending, military spending, things of that nature, and less on civilian spending, social programs, what have you. So, how do you imagine a world of economic development that is increasingly tied to military spending?
Yeah. So that's actually the most dangerous scenario, right? So we must understand why this kind of a military spending is making economic sense. Since other sectors are exhausted, one of the few sectors which can take money and still generate activity is the military sector. The idea is that, so there can be 2, 3 ideas, right? What is the problem? The problem is that the private debt to GDP has become too high. Your debt your income can't sustain the kind of a debt that your society has taken. It's not even the government. If it's a government, you can always argue that we can do something with the money, we can do some printing and get away with it and stuff. But this is the societal leverage. So societal income is not able to sustain the debt. So what can you do? Decrease the debt or increase the income, which is the GDP. So either of these two things can happen, right? How do you decrease the debt? So write-offs is one of the ways, but how much can you write off? If the whole economy is burdened with the debt, either you write off everything, which has got its own complications, or you can't write off, or any small write-off is not going to earn anything. So one of the ways, which is again what Minsky says, one of the ways of getting out of this trap is high inflation, right? Because high inflation, debt are nominal numbers, right? High inflation automatically degrades the debt every year. So a 5-7% or 10% inflation is something like 10% or 5% haircut on the debt every year. So debt automatically starts decreasing. So that is one of the ways in which the economy can get out of this trap. High inflation is one. The second is, and that is the only way debt can be reduced, or you write off everybody's debt, which has got its own game attached to it. Or else increase the production, right? So where can you increase the production? You cannot get the firms to increase their production. If you are a developed nation, you already have all the infrastructure. What can you do about it? You can't break it and make it again and stuff like that. So increase the production. How? So start pushing in the sectors which can still sustain. The problem of frontier sector is that there is only so much that they can take, and there is so much of uncertainty also involved in it, whether it's going to function, not function. We don't know the kind of commitments that have been made related to AI in terms of chips, whether they are going to fructify, not fructify, what will happen out of it. Plus, those frontier sector, innovation heavy sector really generate employment at the scale that is required, at the scale of the investment that is there. So even in the initial days of internet, you couldn't have internet generating huge employment, right? Later on, whatever it evolved. But at the time when the innovation is taking place, its ability to generate employment is also within a question mark. So you don't know over there as well. So you try and do that, but there is only so much limit. So then the sector that becomes is military Keynesianism. You push in the sector, you can generate the employment, you can increase the production. That production will automatically take the GDP higher. So the debt to GDP will come down. Automatically, some amount of semblance of growth would reach the economy via this direction, right? So when that becomes the only sector, and that is the only way you can do it, the main part of that becomes that first you need an environment which justifies it. You cannot just do military without justifying why you are doing military per se, right? And even if you don't justify why you are doing military, just because you are doing military, the environment itself is spoiled, right? Otherwise, you look and you say, why are you doing this? You cannot really say, no, my sectors are exhausted, so therefore I'm investing in military and stuff like that, right? So I'm not saying that this leads to conflicts, but if there is an economic push, the conflict becomes, something like more palatable, so geopolitical tensions are always there. Tensions are always there. Ups and downs within nations, relationships are always there. There's no way that they can go away. But what makes that tensions create conflict? I suspect the economic push is a part of that. When it becomes economically palatable, then you become more reckless as well, in terms of dealing. Because either way, I need the military spending, so let's become a bit more reckless and go ahead with it, right? So that is the first drawback of it, that it requires higher military spending, automatically requires an environment which is security wise justifiable enough to make that investment. That is one. But the second more dangerous aspect is the inventory pressure, right? So you start doing military investment, you have some conflicts going on somewhere, you say that, see, the conflict going on, this can take a broad shape. We are doing something, we have burnt our old missiles, now we need to create new missiles. So I'm going to start doing my military investment in my economy. You start doing that, you start building up your military inventory, you start doing newer and newer weapons. To what extent can you amass your weapons, right? And that World War I, by the way, is a very, very good example of this, right? So the German economy came out of the doldrums. It was because of the rearmament that it did, right? Mm-hmm. So if you'll see, hyperinflation was over by that. So it's not like it came out of hyperinflation, but it came out of economic depression because of the rearmament that it did, right? And that rearmament made Germany a major industrial power, actually. because at the end, you require the same metal, same lathe machines, similar machines for manufacturing weapons compared to what you're going to manufacture infrastructure. So it's not exactly the same technology, but it's not that far a technology as well. It aids both ways, right? Even US. So if you look at the US Great Depression of 1929 US, I don't know if people are aware, when US came out of Great Depression, some people say there was a New Deal and that led to coming out of depression and stuff like that. That's actually not correct. By 1939, US unemployment rate was hovering around 15 to 20%, or 15, 18, 17, 18%, right? And then World War II was right at the doors, and US became the arms supplier of the world at that point of time. Within 6 years, from 1939 1945, the employment reduced to 1.2%, right? So significant impact on the economy per se. But what cost? You have to build up a whole cache of inventory of war equipments. And if you want to do more, then what do? You have to burn those equipments, because there is no other way. You cannot keep on justifying, I have so much of stockpile, but I still want to invest more. While you want to invest more, you must have to burn that. And which essentially means that the pressure of inventory starts making nations even more jittery or even more fast to the trigger. And I suspect of some bit of this played out in World War II as well, right? And that's the deepest thing. So you cannot stop doing it. The employment will fall off, the issues will come up. To keep doing it, you have to justify it. Securitizations are tight. If the stockpile is too much, you have to also burn it. So you have to create then situations where these things have to be burned, right? So then economics and geopolitics get so intertwined that you cannot escape conflicts at all if you land up in this military Keynesianism kind of a scenario for long enough, right? So that creates a very volatile scenario in that sense.
Yeah, thank you. And that's it. And truthfully, and you make a really good point. Germany with before World War II is a good example about, and also with the United States too, about differentiating what sort of was leading to the not just the increasing growth, but also that major drop in unemployment, right? Like you were talking about. But as just a quick final question, because you mentioned how Germany was basically able to get out of its hyperinflation hole with the with military Keynesianism, as it were. But for like smaller economies that don't really have that sheer scale or the kind of the technology that the sort of up-to-date technology, what sort of models or strategies can they use, sort of balancing this sort of fiscal flexibility while meeting the needs of the civilian sector and like the defense sector too?
Right. So this trend of military Keynesianism affects the countries primarily which are drowning in societal debt. So the private debt, household debt, and the firm debt that we have talked about. And so if you today look at the global landscape, which countries have this kind of a debt, private debt scenarios? We are talking about crazy numbers, by the way, right? So US has a private debt of 150% private debt to GDP. Japan has 170%. China has 200 plus percent, right? Europe is between 150 and 200%, everyone over there, right? So the problem now is that most of the countries of the world are in this situation. And that's why you see the rearmament is not just in one country. It's not just US, which is facing something, or frontier European countries, or even Japan is increasing its spending on military. This is after World War II. This is probably the first time. From 1%, they have loosened it to saying that they will go on to 2% of GDP, right? So the problem is that world over, everybody is in a scenario where they cannot escape military Keynesianism. They are all opting for it. Everybody whosoever is and the moment this kind of scenario happens, it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy, right? So can a country sit back when everybody is militarizing? No, it can't, right? You have to increase your militarization as well. So there is hardly anybody who is going to escape this kind of militarization, right? In fact, we have not seen much military activity from China, but China is also in a state where I suspect it might need to opt for that, both. increasingly geopolitical scenarios, as well as either with the economies in doldrums, right? So they both play together well with it. And I suspect even China would be pushed as much by geopolitics as by economics to undertake the same military expansion that is happening the world over, right? So who are the countries who are safe from it as yet, in the sense that they're not forced to do it? Remember, because everybody is doing military, everybody has to do military. So even the countries who are not leveraged and who don't have economic reasons to do military mechanism, they are even forced to upgrade their military, spend in the military and stuff like that. But the countries who are not forced to, truly in among the bigger economies, largely there are only two countries and one partially. So we have India, which is not leveraged at all. The balance sheet, Indian balance sheet, is really clean, both of the firms as well as individuals. Russia, the balance sheet is fairly clean on the individual side, on the household side. Firm side is slightly on the higher side, but not bad. Brazil is another something which is again firm slightly higher side, but overall it's a fairly clean. So there are a couple of countries which are not into that trap yet, right? But the problem is everybody is spending, you have to spend. And for the smaller economies, it becomes even a big threat. So remember, right? If I'm spending too much in military, what do I do with that? I have to justify that. If I take the big war, that can be devastating, right? So you don't want ideally a big war to happen, even if you're doing military spending. Ideally, we don't know the way it goes. Plus, big war can become very costly. So you don't know which side will go, where it will go. So in that sense, to justify military, the tendency to take up small wars is actually higher, because they justify the heightened security threat. They justify your stockpile. They also burn some of your stockpile, and they're not an existential threat to you, right? So the smaller countries can actually get really big burns on that side, right? So there is a I suspect that's a very bad outcome for them, because at the end they are smaller and they now become small pieces in the global geoeconomics chess piece. The only way in which they can then survive is they have to align with someone. So they have to get the protection of big powers. Otherwise, they might become that meal in the overall geoeconomics of the world, right? So not a good time for them at all. In fact, if this military mechanism continues for some period of time, which I suspect it will, because the balance sheets are really exhausted, there is no way that the economies can grow. And once you start tasting the blood, so to say, of military equipment giving you economic growth, as well as the topics for domestic politics and stuff like that, you cannot escape it. If it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy, in 3, 4, 5 years, the rearmament can be very heavy. And if too much heavy rearmament, then you are sitting at a trigger. Some incident somewhere can lead to really big wars, per se, right? So in that sense, I suspect that next couple of years, at least half a decade or so, you will see increasingly more military expenses justified via the global security scenario, but the underlying reason being economic in that sense, right? And more that happens, it'll get more and more volatile. Globally, it will become more and more volatile. So not really a very good scenario for a globe as such.
No, you make a very good point about it being a self-fulfilling prophecy, and let's hope it doesn't become fulfilled, because you make a very good point of once your neighboring country starts investing more and more into rearmament, for whatever reason, other countries will follow suit. So yeah, and how conflicts arise too with this increased military spending, we're going to have to really see how it unfolds and how it connects. But this is going to be the conclusion of this interview. But I do want to thank Professor Vidhu Shekhar for joining us today. Please be sure to look at his articles, Deccan Herald and Swarja, which we'll have the links for the description and below for you guys to view. But until next time, guys, thank you guys so much for watching. Please be sure to like this video if you want Professor Vidhu Shekhar to come back. Subscribe for similar content, and comment on any questions you have on the article or any questions you want to ask him. Please do so in this video. But until next time, guys, thank you for watching, and we'll talk to you again all very soon.